They told you time moves in one direction. They told you it carves men into something harder, older, wiser. But what if I told you there was a girl in Alabama who stepped out of time and never stepped back in? Listen carefully. In 1971, in a town that doesn't appear on most maps anymore, there was a girl whose face did not change. Seasons tore through the cotton fields, presidents fell, wars raged on black and white televisions, but her reflection in the mirror remained untouched. And when the doctors failed to explain it, the town chose silence. You're not here for bedtime stories. You're here because something inside you knows that history isn't what they told you. That behind every small-town mystery, behind every unexplained case, there are forces, psychological, institutional, and sometimes deliberate, that shape reality itself. This is not just about a girl who didn't age. This is about control. It's about what happens when biology collides with obsession, when science collides with power, and when a man decides that nature itself is negotiable. Harwick County, Alabama. The air smelled like red clay and gasoline. The Vietnam War was swallowing boys whole. Trust in government was cracking. Men were beginning to question authority, quietly but dangerously. And in the middle of that unraveling nation, there was a father and a daughter. Her name was Nora Vance. At 16, according to her birth certificate, she still looked 11. Not young for her age, unchanged. No growth spurts, no hormonal shifts, no soft transitions from child to woman. Her classmates matured, their voices deepened, their bodies transformed. They stepped into adolescence like it was a door meant to open. Nora did not. And that is where the fear began. Because men can tolerate tragedy, they can tolerate death, they can even tolerate injustice, but they cannot tolerate the violation of natural law. And when natural law appears broken, someone broke it. You need to understand something before we go deeper. Stagnation is not an accident. When something does not change, when something remains frozen against the current of time, it is either divine intervention or deliberate interference. The town whispered miracle. The doctors whispered anomaly. But one man, one rational, relentless physician, whispered something else: intervention. And once that word entered the room, it never left. This is where your descent begins, because the moment you accept that time can be manipulated, you must also accept that men will try to control it. And if a man can control time within his own home, what else can he control? At first, they called it a phase. That's what small towns do when reality bends. They rename it, they shrink it, they dress it up in something digestible. "She'll catch up," the school nurse said, tapping her clipboard like it held authority over biology. "Some girls are just late bloomers." But Nora Vance was not blooming. She was preserved. By 1972, her classmates had outgrown her physically and emotionally. The girls who once braided her hair were whispering about boys and marriage. The boys who once played tag with her now avoided eye contact, unsettled by the way she seemed frozen in childhood while they stumbled into adolescence. Yet her mind matured. That was the part no one could reconcile. Nora spoke like someone older. She read books far beyond her grade level. She asked questions that made adults uncomfortable, about death, about time, about why people age at all. "Why does the body decay if the mind doesn't want it to?" she once asked her teacher. No one answered. Because the truth is, we accept aging not because we understand it, but because we have no choice. But what if someone did have a choice? Her father, Daniel Vance, worked nights at a fertilizer plant outside Harwick County. Quiet man, methodical, the kind of man who fixed engines for neighbors without charging them, the kind of man who watched everything and said little. People trusted him. That was their first mistake. By late 1973, word had spread beyond Harwick. Doctors from Birmingham began requesting examinations, hormone panels, bone density scans, developmental imaging. They poked, prodded, documented. Every result came back normal. Normal bone age for an 11-year-old. Normal organ development for an 11-year-old. Normal everything. Except she was 18. Birth records confirmed it. Baptismal certificate confirmed it. School enrollment records confirmed it. Time insisted she was older. Her body disagreed. That's when Dr. Harold Mercer entered the story, a visiting endocrinologist with a reputation for challenging medical orthodoxy. He didn't smile much, didn't tolerate superstition, didn't believe in miracles. He believed in variables. And to him, Nora Vance was not divine. She was engineered. He began asking questions no one in Harwick wanted asked. Had she been exposed to chemicals, experimental compounds, radiation from the fertilizer plant? Was there a possibility of long-term hormonal suppression? Daniel Vance bristled at the questions. He refused further testing, refused blood samples, refused hospital admission. And when Dr. Mercer pressed harder, citing potential public health implications, Daniel did something unexpected. He pulled Nora out of school, completely. No more doctors, no more outsiders, no more questions. Isolation is not just a response to fear, it's a strategy. Because once you remove witnesses, you control the narrative. Neighbors began noticing curtains drawn at odd hours, lights on deep into the night, delivery trucks from Birmingham arriving without logos, boxes carried in, never out. The town told itself it was overreacting, but Dr. Mercer did not let it go. He filed a formal report with the state medical board, labeling the case biologically improbable under natural endocrine function. Those were careful words, but what he meant was simple. Someone had found a way to interrupt time. And if that someone was a grieving father or something far larger, Harwick County was sitting on a secret it did not understand. Because here's the truth no one wants to confront. When a system refuses outside scrutiny, it is rarely protecting innocence. It is protecting control. And Daniel Vance was tightening his grip.
Isolation changes people. Not all at once, not in dramatic, cinematic bursts, but slowly, quietly, like moisture rotting wood from the inside out. By 1974, the Vance house no longer felt like part of Harwick County. It felt like a sealed container. The lawn grew uneven, the mailbox leaned, the curtains stayed drawn even during Alabama's harsh summer afternoons. Neighbors would swear they saw lights flicker at 3 a.m., long after Daniel's shift ended at the fertilizer plant. And Nora? She was seen less and less. But when she was seen, she looked the same. 11 years old, small hands, narrow shoulders, soft, unchanged features. Only her eyes betrayed something else, awareness, watchfulness, the kind of gaze that doesn't belong to a child. Rumors spread because silence creates vacuum, and vacuum demands filling. Some said Daniel had made a deal with pharmaceutical researchers experimenting with hormonal inhibitors. The 1970s were not the pristine era people pretend they were. Universities ran quiet trials. The government funded stranger projects than it admitted publicly. Others whispered darker things. Occult preservation rituals, ancient texts, European longevity experiments brought over after World War II, Alabama soil hiding more than cotton. Fear doesn't need evidence. It only needs mystery. Dr. Harold Mercer, however, wasn't interested in folklore. He wanted data. He returned twice that year, uninvited, both times denied entry. On the second visit, he noticed something peculiar, the faint hum of machinery behind the house. Not agricultural equipment, electrical, constant. Daniel claimed it was a generator due to unstable power lines, but Harwick County had no outages that month. Mercer began documenting everything: dates, sightings, behavioral shifts. He suspected something radical: long-term endocrine suppression through synthetic compounds. In simple terms, someone might be chemically halting puberty. But suppression doesn't freeze bone age. It doesn't pause cellular turnover entirely. This was deeper. Meanwhile, inside that house, Nora kept journals. No one knew that then, but years later, fragments would surface. Pages describing the room beneath the stairs, the injections that burn but don't leave marks, and father saying it's for the future. The future. That word keeps returning, doesn't it? Because stagnation isn't about staying young for vanity. It's about extending utility. A body that doesn't age is a body that doesn't expire. And in the early 1970s, institutions, government, private labs, military contractors were obsessed with endurance, with longevity, with optimizing the human vessel. Vietnam exposed fragility. Soldiers aged fast under stress. Trauma deteriorated them. The idea of slowing decay? It wasn't fantasy. It was ambition. Now imagine a man with access to industrial chemicals, proximity to experimental compounds, and a daughter whose biology was still malleable. Daniel Vance began working extra shifts, extra pay, extra deliveries. Neighbors reported the smell, sharp, metallic, unlike fertilizer. And then came the night that fractured everything. November 18th, 1974. A power surge hit the county. Brief, sudden, but every house lost electricity for exactly 43 seconds. Except the Vance home. Its lights stayed on, steady, uninterrupted. Dr. Mercer was at his kitchen table when it happened. He saw the darkness swallow his own home, and through his window, in the distance, the Vance property glowing like a lighthouse in a blackout sea. Backup generators don't engage that fast, not homemade ones, not in 1974. The next morning, Mercer drove out there again, and this time he didn't knock. He walked around back. That's when he saw it. A vent, industrial grade, installed near the foundation, warm air exhaling steadily into cold November air. Daniel Vance wasn't just protecting his daughter. He was running something, and whatever it was, it required power.
Dr. Harold Mercer was not a reckless man. He believed in procedure, documentation, escalation through proper channels. But standing behind the Vance house that morning, watching warm air breathed from an industrial vent embedded in a residential foundation, he felt something unfamiliar. Not curiosity, urgency. Warm air in November, Alabama wasn't unusual, but mechanical ventilation tied to a home that supposedly ran on a simple generator, that was different. That suggested containment, environmental control, stability. Stability preserves things. He crouched low, pressing his palm near the airflow. It wasn't just warm, it was regulated, consistent, like hospital climate control. That's when the back door creaked open. Daniel Vance stood there, not surprised. That detail mattered later. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply said, "You shouldn't be back here, doctor." Calm men are the most dangerous when they've prepared for your arrival. Mercer tried reason, spoke of Nora's health, of potential breakthroughs, of national medical importance. He even used the word historic. Daniel listened. Then he said something that never appeared in the official reports. "She's ahead of her time. You're trying to drag her back into yours." It wasn't the tone of a father protecting a sick child. It was the tone of a man guarding a prototype. Mercer requested one final evaluation, neutral site, state oversight, controlled testing. Daniel refused. And then he added something worse. "Leave us alone or I'll make sure you can't practice in this county again." Threats only work when you have leverage. So what leverage did a fertilizer plant worker have over a state-recognized endocrinologist? That question haunted Mercer more than the vent. Within weeks, small retaliations began. Anonymous complaints filed against Mercer's practice, audit inquiries, a rumor circulated that he falsified hormone data in previous cases. Patients began canceling appointments. It was surgical, targeted. Someone was protecting Daniel Vance, or what he was doing. Meanwhile, inside the sealed house, Nora's journals grew darker. She wrote about the cold room that isn't cold, about machines that hum like bees behind the walls, about father measuring time differently. One entry, dated December 2nd, 1974, read, "He says I won't have to grow up like the others. He says they waste their youth on decay." Youth on decay. That isn't the language of a child. That's ideology. And ideology transforms experiments into missions. Harwick County began experiencing small anomalies. Pets went missing near the Vance property. Electrical interference reported by neighbors. Radios crackled when passing the driveway. Nothing concrete, but patterns don't need to be dramatic to be real. Then came the first confirmed physical shift. Not in Nora, in Daniel. He looked older. Not naturally older, accelerated. Deepened lines in his face, tremors in his hands, graying hair almost overnight. It was as if something in that house was consuming years from one vessel to preserve another. That theory sounds impossible. It should. But Mercer, despite being a man of science, began considering energy redistribution models, radical, fringe biological hypotheses about cellular transfer, hormonal siphoning, experimental metabolic suppression balanced by external stimulation. If you freeze one system, where does the energy go? Nora remained 11. Daniel aged rapidly. And somewhere beneath that house, machines hummed through the night, maintaining a balance the world was not meant to witness. The question was no longer whether something unnatural was happening. The question was who else knew. Because a small-town father doesn't build industrial-grade systems alone, and preservation of youth isn't a personal project. It's a market, and markets attract powerful partners.
By early 1975, Daniel Vance looked like a man 20 years older than his driver's license claimed. He moved slower. His back curved inward. His once steady hands now trembled when he reached for groceries at Miller's Market. People noticed, but in small towns, noticing and confronting are two very different things. They whispered instead. "Stress," they said. "Single parenting ages you." But stress doesn't hollow out a man's eyes in 6 months. Stress doesn't carve new decades into a face. Dr. Mercer saw it clearly the day Daniel came into town to refill a prescription, not for Nora, for himself. Blood pressure medication. The dosage was aggressive. Mercer kept his voice neutral. "You've deteriorated quickly." Daniel smiled, thin, brittle. "Some things cost more than money, doctor." That sentence should have triggered alarms. Instead, it confirmed Mercer's worst suspicion. This was not random. This was exchange. While Daniel weakened, Nora remained unchanged, 11 in body, now nearly 19 in calendar years. But something else was shifting. Witnesses who caught rare glimpses of her described her movements as precise, less childlike, her posture straighter, her speech measured, like someone studying adulthood from the inside of a glass box. And then there were the deliveries. Unmarked vans began arriving after midnight, no logos, no commercial plates from Harwick County. The drivers never stayed long, always 15 minutes or less. Daniel never signed anything outside.
Boxes were carried directly around back, toward the vent, toward the humming. Mercer escalated his concerns to the state medical board again, this time adding suspected illegal experimentation. He referenced classified research programs from the late 60s, military endurance studies, metabolic manipulation, hormone stabilization trials rumored to be funded quietly after Vietnam's early failures. He didn't have proof. He had patterns. But patterns, when ignored, become history's regrets. The board responded with silence, not rejection, not approval. Silence. That's when Mercer realized something that changed the entire frame of the case. If higher authorities were uninterested in intervening, it wasn't because they lacked information. It was because they already had it. Inside the Vance home, Nora's journal entries grew stranger. January 14, 1975. He says the transfer works better when he's tired. He says I must stay still. He says time is fluid if you contain it. Transfer. Works better when he's tired. Stay still. That is not poetry. That is procedure. Mercer began reviewing fringe biological research, studies dismissed publicly but funded privately. The concept of metabolic borrowing, accelerated aging in one organism paired with suppressed development in another. The science wasn't proven, but the math was seductive. If cellular degradation could be externally stimulated in one body and regenerative hormones stabilized in another, in theory, you could distort perceived aging. Not true immortality, but controlled delay. And in 1970s America, a nation obsessed with advancement, dominance, and beating the clock, that idea wasn't madness, it was leverage. Then came the incident that shattered doubt. February 3, 1975. A fire broke out in a neighboring shed less than 50 yards from the Vance property. Small blaze, electrical, officials said. But witnesses claimed something else. They said when the flames rose, Nora stood outside, barefoot in winter, watching, unmoved, unafraid. And for a split second, one neighbor swore her reflection in the firelight looked older, not physically, but present, aware, like someone calculating outcomes. The fire department contained the blaze quickly, but the Vance house remained untouched, because beneath that quiet, sealed structure, something was being balanced, and Daniel Vance was running out of years to give.
After the shed fire, something changed in Harwick County. Fear stopped being quiet. People began locking their doors earlier. Parents called their children inside before dusk. It wasn't rational. There was no prime wave, no official threat, but the air felt altered, charged, like a storm hovering just beyond visibility. Daniel Vance stopped going to Miller's Market entirely. Groceries were delivered now, prescriptions too. He avoided eye contact with neighbors, avoided town meetings, avoided sunlight whenever possible. And he was shrinking, not metaphorically, physically. His clothes hung looser, his spine curved deeper, his skin thinned to parchment. In less than a year, he appeared close to 70. He was 46. Dr. Mercer reviewed hospital records quietly. Daniel had no terminal diagnosis, no cancer, no degenerative neurological disorder, just accelerated systemic decline, organs aging faster than statistical probability allowed. Meanwhile, Nora remained 11, unchanged, untouched by puberty, untouched by time, but not untouched by awareness. In March 1975, a boy named Caleb Morris claimed he saw her standing at her bedroom window at 2 a.m. He was cutting through the Vance property on a dare, teenage bravado colliding with local legend. He swore her eyes reflected light unnaturally, not glowing, reflecting, like glass. And when he waved, jokingly, she did not wave back. She tilted her head, studying him, as if measuring. Caleb never crossed that yard again. Inside the house, Nora's journal entries grew more fragmented. March 18. The humming is louder now. He says he must increase the current. March 23. He says it won't hurt him much longer. He says this is how pioneers suffer. Pioneers. That word matters. Pioneers believe they are justified by the future. They accept sacrifice, especially if the sacrifice is themselves. But here's what no one asked. Was Daniel Vance sacrificing himself willingly, or was he convinced he had to? Mercer attempted one final intervention. He contacted a colleague in Birmingham, a bioelectric researcher who had once consulted on military stamina trials, off record, quietly. He described the symptoms, the accelerated aging in one subject, the halted development in another, the consistent power draw from a residential property. The colleague paused for a long time before answering. Then he said 3 words: Energy Redistribution Protocol. Mercer felt the blood drain from his face. It was theoretical, barely tested, involved controlled electromagnetic stimulation combined with endocrine suppression compounds. The concept wasn't to transfer age directly, that was impossible, but to destabilize cellular decay patterns in one organism while reinforcing stability in another. Highly experimental, dangerous, unstable outside lab conditions, and absolutely not approved for civilian application. "Who's funding this?" Mercer asked. The colleague's reply was colder than expected. "If it's running in Alabama, it isn't civilian." That was the moment the case stopped being local. Because if Daniel Vance had access to experimental protocols tied to federal research, then someone supplied him, someone monitored him, someone allowed this to continue, and perhaps someone needed data. The next power surge hit on April 2, 1975. Longer this time, 61 seconds. Every home in Harwick County went dark, except one. The Vance house glowed steady and bright, humming louder than ever. And when the lights returned across town, Daniel Vance collapsed. Ambulance records show he was transported at 2:14 a.m., severe cardiac arrhythmia, multi-system fatigue, biological markers consistent with extreme age, though his birth certificate insisted otherwise. He survived, barely. And Nora? Witnesses said she stood in the yard as the ambulance left, expressionless, unchanged, 11 years old, watching her father be carried away like a drained battery. Because when you manipulate systems you don't fully control, eventually something destabilizes, and balance demands repayment.
Daniel Vance returned home 3 days later. That, more than anything, unsettled Dr. Mercer. A man in that condition, heart irregular, organs failing, blood markers resembling someone decades older, should not have been discharged so quickly. Yet the hospital records were thin, minimal testing, no extended observation. Almost as if someone higher up decided his file required closing. When Daniel stepped out of the car, neighbors watched from behind curtains. He moved slower than before, leaning heavily on the door for balance. His face had thinned further, cheekbones sharp against stretched skin. But his eyes were focused, determined, like a man who believed the worst was behind him. That was the problem, because the worst wasn't behind him, it was beneath him.
Inside the house, the humming resumed within hours of his return. Stronger, steadier. Mercer parked 2 blocks away that night, engine off, windows cracked. He told himself he was observing for medical concern. In truth, he was waiting for confirmation that his fear wasn't paranoia. At 11:47 p.m., the lights inside the Vance home flickered. At 11:49, they stabilized. At 11:52, the faint tremor hit. Not enough to register as an earthquake, but enough to rattle loose mailboxes and unsettle sleeping dogs. And then something impossible happened. For exactly 12 seconds, the hum stopped. Complete silence. The kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Then it roared back, louder than before. Mercer's radio crackled with interference. Static flooded every frequency. Even the local country station dissolved into distortion. Electromagnetic discharge. Controlled or failing. The next morning, Nora appeared outside for the first time in weeks, barefoot again, standing in the sunlight, unchanged. But something about her posture had shifted. Witnesses later described it as adult. Her stance wasn't that of a child anymore. It was balanced, intentional, shoulders squared, like someone inhabiting a smaller frame than they were meant to. Daniel joined her minutes later, gripping the porch railing for support. He looked worse, much worse. Hands visibly trembling now, skin almost translucent, a cough that sounded deep, internal, mechanical. Yet when he looked at Nora, his expression wasn't regret, it was pride. That detail haunted Mercer, because pride suggests success, and if Daniel believed he had succeeded, then the protocol was working. Inside Nora's journal, the entries became more lucid. April 6th. He says the system is stabilizing. He says I will not cross into decay like the others. He says the world isn't ready yet. The world isn't ready. For what? An ageless body? Or proof that time could be distorted? Because here's what most people don't understand about scientific ambition. It's never about one subject. It's about scalability. If Daniel Vance had stabilized biological delay in a residential basement, then whoever backed him wasn't interested in saving a single girl. They were collecting proof of concept. And proof requires sacrifice. By mid-April, Daniel stopped leaving the house entirely. Deliveries continued, unmarked, midnight arrivals, boxes in, nothing out. Mercer contacted his Birmingham colleague again. This time the response was colder. Stop asking questions. That wasn't advice, it was warning. Then came the phone call that confirmed everything had escalated. April 17th, 1975, 2:03 a.m. Mercer's home line rang once. He answered. Silence. Then a single sentence, spoken calmly. You're observing something beyond your clearance. Click. No threats, no shouting, just clarity. Clearance. That word doesn't belong in small-town medical disputes. It belongs to institutions, to programs, to projects. Mercer realized then that Daniel Vance was not acting alone. He was operating within permission. And Nora was no longer just a daughter. She was data. And when a human being becomes data, their preservation is not about love. It's about ownership. The hum beneath the Vance house grew louder each night, and Daniel Vance was running out of time. But Nora was not aging at all.
By late April 1975, Hardwick County no longer felt like a town. It felt like a perimeter. 2 unfamiliar sedans began appearing near the county line at irregular hours. Out-of-state plates, clean vehicles, always parked just far enough away from the Vance property to avoid direct suspicion, but close enough to observe. They never entered town. They never stopped for gas. They simply watched. Dr. Mercer noticed them first. Patterns are easy to spot when you've already accepted you're inside one. The sedans rotated drivers, different faces, same posture, same stillness. Men who did not fidget, did not smoke, did not socialize. They were not neighbors. They were monitoring. Inside the van's house, the humming grew deeper in tone, less mechanical, more resonant, the kind of vibration that travels through floorboards and settles in bone. Neighbors complained of headaches, insomnia, pets refusing to enter yards adjacent to the property. Subtle effects, but measurable. Daniel Vance was no longer seen at all. Deliveries continued, but now the drivers wore identical dark jackets, no logos, no conversation. They moved efficiently, carrying reinforced cases instead of cardboard boxes. This wasn't fertilizer plant improvisation anymore. This was infrastructure. Mercer made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would enter the property, not as a doctor, as a witness. On May 2, 1975, just after midnight, he approached from the rear, the same path he'd taken months before. The vent near the foundation was louder now, pulsing with regulated bursts of heat. A faint metallic scent hung in the air, ozone mixed with something chemical. The back door was unlocked. That detail would replay in his mind for years. Unlocked, as if someone expected him. Inside, the house felt wrong, too organized, too sterile. Furniture pushed aside to accommodate cabling running along baseboards, walls subtly reinforced, the air colder than outside despite Alabama's rising humidity. And beneath it all, that hum. Mercer followed it, down the narrow hallway, past Nora's room. He glanced inside. Her bed was made perfectly, but she wasn't there. The humming led to a door near the kitchen, one that had once been a pantry, now reinforced, metal latch, industrial hinge. It wasn't locked. He opened it. Stairs descended into light, bright clinical light. The basement had been transformed, not crudely, professionally. Metallic framework surrounded a central reclining apparatus, half medical chair, half restraint system. Cables extended from a generator unit into panels embedded in the walls. Gouges monitored electrical output. IV stands positioned with surgical precision. And in the center of it all, Nora, seated upright in the apparatus, eyes open, unblinking. Electrodes attached at her temples, wrists, and spine. She did not look distressed. She looked focused. Across from her, connected by mirrored wiring and IV lines, was Daniel. He was barely conscious, skin paper-thin, veins pronounced, chest rising in shallow, uneven intervals. The machines between them pulsed rhythmically, energy cycling. Mercer stepped forward instinctively, horror overtaking analysis. "Nora?" Her voice shifted to him, calm, ancient. "He told you not to interfere," she said softly. Her voice did not match her body. It carried weight, not childish tone, measured cadence. The gauges spiked as she spoke. Daniel stirred weakly. "Almost stable," he whispered. Mercer looked at the wiring, the mirrored configuration, and understanding hit him with cold clarity. This wasn't direct age transfer. It was metabolic destabilization in one subject, synchronized with hormonal and cellular reinforcement in another. Daniel's body was being pushed into accelerated entropy, forcing systemic degradation at a controlled rate. The byproduct? Sustained stasis in Nora. He wasn't giving her youth, he was absorbing decay. The system demanded imbalance to create preservation. Mercer reached for the main power lever. Before he could touch it, Nora's voice stopped him. If you shut it down now, he dies. Not pleading, stating. And for the first time, Mercer saw it clearly. This was no longer a father experimenting on his daughter. This was collaboration. Because Nora's expression wasn't fear, it was calculation. She wasn't a passive subject. She was choosing this. And the men in the sedans outside, they weren't guarding Daniel. They were guarding the outcome. Because if the protocol stabilized fully, they would not need him anymore. Only her.
The machines did not sound mechanical anymore. They sounded alive. Each pulse between Daniel and Nora carried a rhythm that felt intentional, almost communicative. Mercer stood frozen at the base of the basement stairs, staring at the impossible symmetry of wires, tubes, and mirrored monitors. Daniel's heartbeat faltered across one screen. Nora's stabilized. A direct inversion. Energy wasn't transferring like electricity. It was balancing like a scale. Daniel's voice came again, weaker now. It's close. Mercer, it's almost self-sustaining. Self-sustaining. That word dropped heavier than anything else in the room, because if the system no longer required active calibration, if it ran independently, then Daniel would no longer be necessary. Nora's eyes never left Mercer's. There was something unsettling in her stillness. No trembling, no confusion, no fear. Father built the bridge, she said quietly, but I'm the one who can cross it. The monitors flickered. A deep oscillation passed through the walls, so strong that dust shook loose from ceiling beams. The generator unit beside them glowed faintly along its seams. Mercer stepped back. He finally understood why the cars outside never intervened. They weren't protecting the experiment from exposure. They were protecting it from interruption. This wasn't a rogue scientist's madness. It had funding, oversight, contingency plans. Daniel coughed violently, blood spotting his collar. Mercer, you always wanted proof of concept. You're looking at it. Proof. But of what? Extended youth? Controlled decay? Or something far more dangerous? The gauge labeled synchronicity edged upward. 91%, 92%, 93%. Nora inhaled slowly, deliberately, and Daniel aged. It was subtle but unmistakable. Fine lines deepened across his face in real time. His hands trembled, skin loosening as though years were compressing into seconds. Mercer's medical training screamed at him. Cells don't collapse that quickly without catastrophic failure, unless they're being forced to. Stop this, Mercer whispered. Daniel's eyes softened. I can't. And that was the truth. Not because he lacked will, because the system no longer belonged to him. Nora tilted her head slightly. You're afraid of what I become, but you're not afraid of what the world already is. The oscillation sharpened, no longer a hum, but a resonant vibration that made Mercer's teeth ache. The gauge reached 97%. Daniel's breathing staggered. Once it stabilizes, he managed, she won't need continuous input, only periodic correction. Periodic correction, like maintenance, like refueling. A cold realization gripped Mercer. If Daniel dies and the system stabilizes, someone else would take his place. The sedans outside weren't just observers, they were candidates. Mercer lunged for the control console. Nora's voice shifted, not louder, but layered. Don't. The word hit like pressure against his chest. The generator surged. 100%. The screens flashed white. For a fraction of a second, every light in the basement went out. Silence. Absolute. Then the machines powered back on. Softer now. Steadier. Daniel slumped forward, the restraints holding him upright. Monitors showed minimal output from his side, but Nora's? Perfectly stable. Pulse consistent. Cellular activity normalized. The system no longer cycled aggressively. It maintained. Nora slowly raised her hands. The electrodes detached automatically. The restraints clicked open. She stepped down from the apparatus with effortless balance. Daniel remained seated, unmoving, not dead, but emptied. Nora walked toward Mercer. Her footsteps echoed lightly on the concrete floor. Up close, her skin was flawless, unmarked, ageless in a way that felt mathematically wrong. "He did what he was meant to do," she said calmly. Mercer looked at Daniel, alive but barely, a shell sustained by minimal support. "You drained him," Mercer said hoarsely. "No," Nora replied. "He offered." Footsteps sounded above, not inside the house, outside, doors opening, car engines shutting off. The sedans had finally moved. Nora turned her head slightly, listening. "They'll come in 5 minutes." "Who are they?" Mercer demanded. Her eyes returned to him, no longer ancient, no longer childlike, strategic. "They're the ones who want to know if it works." Mercer's stomach dropped. "And if it does?" Nora's expression didn't change. "Then they won't ask permission next time." The knock at the front door was not loud. It didn't need to be. It carried authority, precise, measured, patient. Mercer's pulse thundered in his ears as he looked from Nora to Daniel's barely breathing form. The basement felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves were aware that the experiment had crossed a threshold. Nora tilted her head slightly, listening to the rhythm of the knock. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Deliberate. "They always signal like that," she said calmly. Mercer swallowed. "You've met them before?" "Yes." Upstairs, the front door opened without force. That detail told Mercer everything. They had a key. Footsteps entered the house. Not hurried, not cautious. Controlled. Confident. 2 sets. Possibly 3. Mercer moved instinctively toward Daniel, checking his pulse. Weak, thread-like, but present. "He needs a hospital," Mercer whispered. Nora shook her head. "No hospital would understand what he is now." The footsteps crossed the living room. No hesitation, no searching. They knew the layout. They were heading directly toward the kitchen, toward the pantry door, toward the basement. Mercer's mind raced. If these men were government, this would disappear into classified vaults. If they were private contractors, it would be monetized. If they were something else entirely, the basement door opened. 2 men descended first, identical dark jackets, clean boots, calm eyes. A third remained at the top of the stairs, watching. No badges, no introductions. The first man scanned the room with clinical precision. His gaze paused on the stabilized monitors, then on Nora, then finally on Daniel. "Status?" he asked. His voice carried no emotion. Nora answered before Mercer could speak. "Primary transfer complete. Maintenance cycle established. Donor viability minimal, but sustained." The man nodded once, satisfied. He turned to Mercer. "You're Dr. Thomas Mercer." Not a question. Mercer's throat tightened. "And you are?" The man ignored that. "You weren't authorized to observe phase stabilization." Phase. The word felt bureaucratic, sanitized, as if this had been scheduled long before Daniel ever set foot in a lab. Mercer steadied himself. "You're draining him to keep her like this?" The second man finally spoke. Incorrect framing. He stepped closer to the apparatus, inspecting the mirrored wiring. This is resource redistribution. Resource. Daniel Vance reduced to a consumable input. Mercer's stomach turned. The first man looked at Nora again. Cognitive integrity? Intact, she replied smoothly. Autonomy? She held his gaze. Independent. A brief silence passed between them, something unspoken but acknowledged. The man gave a slight nod. Good. Mercer's mind snapped into clarity. They weren't here to shut it down. They were here to replicate it. You can't seriously think this is scalable. The metabolic collapse alone is manageable, the second man interrupted, with proper donor rotation. Donor rotation. The phrase echoed like a gunshot. Daniel wasn't unique. He was proof of viability. The third man at the top of the stairs spoke for the first time. Transport will arrive in 12 minutes. Transport. Mercer stepped in front of Daniel's chair. You're not taking her. The first man studied him carefully. We're not taking her, he said evenly. She's coming voluntarily. Nora walked forward, standing beside Mercer, close enough that he could feel the unnatural steadiness of her presence. I want to see how far it goes, she said quietly. Mercer stared at her. You're 13. She met his eyes without blinking. I'm not. Footsteps approached outside, heavier now, multiple vehicles. Mercer's options were collapsing. If he resisted, they would remove him. If he complied, he became complicit. The first man extended a small device toward Nora, sleek, metallic, humming faintly. Calibration interface, he said, for remote monitoring. She took it without hesitation. The second man moved toward Daniel's chair. Donor remains on site. Observation period, 30 days. Observation, to see how long an emptied body could persist. Mercer felt something inside him fracture. This isn't medicine, he whispered. The first man finally looked directly into his eyes. No, he agreed, it's policy. Outside, the transport engine idled. Nora turned toward the stairs. She paused beside Mercer for just a second. You could have left, she said softly. You chose to stay. Before he could respond, she walked upward into the kitchen light. The men followed. Within minutes, the transports were gone. The house fell silent again, except for the softened hum of the stabilized machine. Daniel remained in the chair, alive, barely. Mercer stood alone in the basement, staring at the apparatus that had just shifted the balance of nature itself. And for the first time, he realized the most terrifying truth of all. This was never about saving a child. It was about manufacturing one who never needed saving.
Silence stretched over the house, thick and oppressive, like smoke that refused to dissipate. Mercer's hands shook as he reached for the monitors, scanning Daniel's vitals. The numbers were stable, remarkably so, but every reading felt like a lie. He leaned closer, noticing the subtle twitch in Daniel's fingers, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Alive, yes, but trapped, like a candle flame caught in a jar, flickering but contained. Upstairs, faint creaks told Mercer that Nora was moving. She was walking through the kitchen, methodical, deliberate, her shadow stretching long across the linoleum floor. She wasn't hurried. She didn't look back. She was waiting. For what, he couldn't tell. The basement felt smaller than before, every shadow sharper, every heartbeat amplified. Mercer realized he had no allies here. The world outside had no idea what had just occurred. No law, no media, no conscience could touch what had been done in this house. He approached Daniel again. His hands hovered over the boy's arm, as though touching him could somehow undo the unnatural calmness, the quiet terror that now radiated from the chair. "You're okay," Mercer muttered, even though he knew it wasn't true. Above him, a soft metallic click echoed from the stairs. Mercer looked up just in time to see the faint glow of the calibration interface that Nora had accepted earlier. It pulsed lightly, almost like a heartbeat. Hers, theirs, some combination of the two. A thought struck Mercer with sudden, sickening clarity. "They can watch her anywhere," he whispered. "Anywhere, anytime." The basement door rattled slightly. Not a knock this time, something heavier. The kind of sound that said the next movement would not be optional. Mercer's pulse accelerated. He realized then that he had a choice: stay and watch, resist and fail, or vanish and leave the girl to whatever path she had chosen. But leaving Daniel alone, that wasn't an option. Not now, not ever. Mercer crouched beside the chair, gripping the cold metal arms. "I'll find a way," he said, more to himself than to Daniel. "I promise I'll find a way." Above, footsteps approached, closer this time, deliberate, synchronized. He could hear the faint murmur of the men outside the kitchen, their voices low and calculated. Nora's voice then drifted down the stairs, eerily calm. "They always want to control it," she said softly. "But some things can't be controlled." Mercer looked up, feeling a chill run down his spine. She was speaking of herself, of Daniel, or of something far larger than either of them. And in that moment, Mercer understood something terrifying. He had entered a house full of secrets, but he was not the one holding them. The secret was alive, and it was waiting. The basement hum continued, steady, persistent. The glow of the monitors bathed Daniel in a spectral light. Time stretched. Moments passed like hours. Mercer realized the impossible. The experiment had ended, but nothing had concluded. Not really. Outside, the engines of the transport idled, ready to reclaim what had been borrowed. Inside, a new force had awakened, and the first flicker of fear that Mercer had tried to suppress finally became real. Because he knew, with every fiber of his being, that the true test was only beginning.
The night outside had thickened into something almost tactile, the kind of darkness that presses against your chest and makes every whisper seem amplified. Mercer stayed crouched beside Daniel, every muscle coiled, every sense alert. The basement's fluorescent hum now felt like a countdown, a ticking heartbeat that marked the approach of inevitability. Above, Nora moved again. Her steps were deliberate, almost ceremonial. Each footfall echoed across the kitchen floor, resonating like a signal to forces invisible, forces that Mercer was only beginning to sense. The air smelled faintly metallic, an acrid tension he couldn't identify but instinctively feared. Then came the faint scratching at the windows, not violent, not urgent, but rhythmic, unnerving in its patience. Mercer rose slowly, glancing toward the staircase. He could see the faint outline of the men outside, silhouetted by the weak glow of the streetlights. They weren't running. They weren't threatening. They were observing, waiting. Mercer's throat tightened. These weren't ordinary observers. These were precise, calculated. He had seen operatives like them before, in reports that now seemed irrelevant, stories of silent programs, untraceable operations, and the inexplicable disappearances that never made headlines. And now they were here. Daniel stirred slightly, his eyes flicking open. Mercer leaned close, whispering, "Stay calm, don't speak." But Daniel's gaze, wide and innocent, reflected something darker. He already sensed the magnitude of what was happening. Nora's voice floated down the stairs, soft and chillingly confident. "They always come when the anomaly exceeds expectation." Mercer froze. Anomaly. That word hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't just a term, it was a verdict. Daniel, and perhaps even Nora herself, were no longer merely children of circumstance. They had become variables in a system far older and far more methodical than any Mercer had ever imagined. Outside, a low hum began to join the basement's artificial rhythm. Vehicles moved into position silently, their engines muffled, as if sound itself had been filtered. Mercer realized the perimeter had been established long ago. They were never coming to negotiate. This was a containment, an observation, and, if necessary, an extraction. He glanced at Daniel again. The boy's eyes, so unnervingly calm, seemed to reflect knowledge that Mercer could not fathom. Something in him had shifted during the hours they'd spent underground. Awareness, comprehension, a quiet understanding that the world above had rules, but the world below, the house, the basement, had none. Nora descended fully now, appearing behind Mercer like a shadow given form. Her gaze met his. "You think you can protect him," she said, her voice soft, yet laced with authority. "But protection is an illusion. Control is the only constant, and the constant has already arrived." Mercer's pulse tightened. She wasn't threatening him. She was reminding him of a truth he had not yet fully grasped. He swallowed hard. The basement, the house, the night, they no longer were his domain. He was intruding in a realm where every movement had been predicted, every choice calculated, and every outcome already weighed. From above, the hum intensified. Lights glinted off the steel frames of equipment, the glimmer of unblinking eyes watching from unseen angles. And in that instant, Mercer understood the scale of what he had walked into. This wasn't just an experiment. It was a silent siege, and it was only beginning.
The basement's dim light flickered, casting long, uneven shadows that twisted across the concrete floor. Mercer's eyes darted toward the staircase, his heartbeat drumming in his ears, matching the distant, precise rhythm of the men outside. Every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary stakeout. This was a performance, a test, and he was both audience and participant. Nora's movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. She didn't ascend the stairs in haste, didn't speak, didn't glance at Mercer or Daniel. She simply appeared, a wraith-like figure carrying the weight of knowledge she was forbidden to share, her presence commanding without uttering a command. And the outside observers, they responded. Lights flickered across windows as if acknowledging her, silent nods invisible through glass. She was both the key and the gatekeeper. Mercer's unease metastasized into something colder. This wasn't just surveillance, it was orchestration. The hum of engines, the occasional scrape of boots against gravel, the faint whir of unseen machinery, all synchronized, all deliberate. It wasn't just Nora they were watching, it was the interaction, the small, subtle signs that Mercer and Daniel could not yet decipher. Then she paused. The silence was deafening, and in that stillness, Mercer saw it. A pattern, almost imperceptible, in the way her shoulders shifted, the angle of her head. She was signaling, not to him, not to Daniel, but to them. The men outside, the orchestrators of this dark theater, acknowledged it. And for a terrifying moment, Mercer understood. Everything in this house, every step he took, every breath had already been calculated, anticipated, controlled. Daniel stirred again, whispering a single word. "Why?" Mercer didn't answer. There was no answer. He didn't fully understand it himself, not yet. All he knew was that the game had rules he didn't know, and the stakes were far higher than he could have imagined. The anomaly that Nora represented, it wasn't just her physical stasis, it was the awareness she carried, the authority embedded in her very being. The hum intensified. It was now layered, almost musical in its precision, echoing the calculated patience of the men outside. And then a low voice, filtered through some unseen speaker, spoke from the shadows. "Observation complete. Phase 1 engaged." Mercer's pulse spiked. Phase 1. The words were clinical, detached, utterly devoid of empathy.
This was a system, a hierarchy, and he had stumbled into its edges. Nora turned to the basement door, pausing just long enough for her gaze to meet Mercer's. Her eyes were mirrors of calm inevitability. "They are not here to negotiate," she said, her voice whispering the undeniable truth. "They are here to integrate, and you are already inside their calculation." The basement air thickened. Mercer realized that what had begun as a mystery, the girl who never aged, the strange concoctions, the unexplainable stasis, was merely a fragment of a larger, infinitely darker mechanism, a system that calculated obedience, awareness, and deviation with cold precision. Outside, shadows shifted. Inside, the basement pulsed with anticipation. And Mercer knew, with a gut-level certainty, that there would be no retreat, only descent.
The basement seemed to breathe, walls contracting and expanding with a rhythm that Mercer could feel in his chest. Nora didn't move toward him or Daniel yet. She remained a silent sentinel, her presence both anchor and threat. Then, with the slow precision of a metronome, she retrieved a small obsidian box from a hidden shelf. Mercer's instinct screamed, "Don't!" Mercer's fingers trembled as he reached for the box, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name. Inside there were papers, ancient, brittle, covered in ink that shimmered oddly in the dim light. Symbols crawled across the pages like living things, diagrams of the human mind twisted into impossible forms. It was a map of secrets, a ledger of control, detailing techniques and rituals that had guided entire families and institutions for centuries. Each line pulsed with silent authority, demanding recognition. Daniel leaned closer, eyes wide, and whispered, This isn't just knowledge, it's power." Mercer felt it too, a magnetic pull that threatened to consume his will, and yet he couldn't look away. This was the forbidden history they had all been warned about, the truths no one alive was meant to uncover. The air thickened, almost viscous, as if the basement itself was aware of the transgression. Every shadow seemed to move with intent, the corners deepening into darkness that reached for them. Mercer's mind raced, trying to reconcile the rational with the impossible. Each page revealed layers of manipulation, control over thought, over fear, over loyalty. It wasn't just history, it was a blueprint, a guide for bending human will without leaving a trace. Nora spoke for the first time in hours, her voice low, a strange resonance in the confined space. "Once you see, you cannot unsee," she said. Her eyes, impossibly bright, held both warning and invitation. "To understand fully is to step beyond the world you know. There is no returning." Mercer swallowed hard, aware that the moment they lingered, the deeper they would fall. Daniel, normally so skeptical, now felt a weight in his chest, the gravity of truths unfolding around him. He realized this was a test, not of knowledge alone, but of character, of willpower. To possess these secrets meant more than understanding. It demanded assimilation, a transformation of the self, a willingness to confront darkness both outside and within. And then, as if sensing their hesitation, the shadows around the shelves flickered. Shapes emerged, half glimpses of figures who had lived and vanished within these rituals, warnings etched into reality. Mercer and Daniel froze, their hearts pounding, understanding in that silent moment that this basement wasn't merely a room, it was a threshold. The question lingered in the air. Were they seekers or intruders? And with that question, the room seemed to lean in closer, as though expecting an answer that would bind them to secrets they could never leave behind.
The candlelight flickered violently, casting long, twisting shadows across the basement walls. Mercer's hands hovered over the papers, reluctant yet drawn.
Then he noticed it. Scrawled in a margin, almost hidden, a phrase repeated twice: "Ashes hold the truth." It wasn't a mere notation. It was an incantation, a key, a symbol of identity within the labyrinth they had entered. Nora's voice cut through the tense air, low and commanding. "Speak it. Say it aloud. Twice." Mercer hesitated, feeling the weight of the words. To vocalize them was to acknowledge the path, to cement their descent into the forbidden. Daniel, eyes wide, nodded slightly, mirroring Mercer's dread. Slowly, almost reverently, they repeated, "Ashes hold the truth. Ashes hold the truth." The sound resonated through the basement, vibrating against the cold stone, and for a moment the shadows paused, as if listening. The room seemed to shift around them. The air thickened, charged with a current of unseen energy. Something had awakened. The repetition was not arbitrary. It was a seal, an alignment. By speaking it twice, they were no longer mere observers. They were participants, now entwined with the very knowledge that had eluded centuries. The papers seemed to respond, the ink darkening, forming new symbols that had not been there moments ago. It was as if the basement itself exhaled a long-held secret. Nora's eyes glinted with an unnerving intensity. "Do you understand what you've done?" she asked, almost rhetorically. Mercer and Daniel shook their heads, caught between awe and fear. "You have marked yourselves," she continued, "chosen to see beyond the veil. The world outside this room will never be the same to you. You carry the knowledge now, and with it, the consequences." A low hum rose from the walls, subtle but pervasive. The shadows shifted, taking shapes almost human, almost alive, whispering fragments of secrets too fragmented to comprehend fully. Mercer felt a chill creep along his spine. Every instinct screamed retreat, yet some primal curiosity anchored him in place. To flee now would be to betray the awakening that had begun. Daniel's gaze fell back on the papers. Every page now pulsed with significance. Names, dates, rituals, interwoven with the phrase they had just spoken, revealed patterns of manipulation and control, of empires and families bound by secrets, guiding history from behind a curtain. Mercer's mind raced. Each revelation was a thread, pulling them deeper into a tapestry of influence that spanned centuries. The threshold had been crossed. Mercer and Daniel had invoked it themselves. From this point forward, nothing would feel ordinary. Their identities were shifting, their perception of reality bending, and the shadows seemed to smile. The walls of the basement seemed to lean inward, as if the house itself were listening. Mercer felt the air grow heavier, thick with the weight of accumulated secrets, and Daniel's fingers trembled over the papers. One phrase, "Ashes hold the truth," had not only aligned them with the hidden world, it had opened a doorway, and through it, history began to whisper its darkest manipulations. Nora's voice was sharper now, slicing through the silence. "Do you see it?" she asked, gesturing toward the papers. At first glance, they were just old documents, receipts, letters, and faded diaries. But Mercer's eyes adjusted, and suddenly patterns emerged, timelines that defied coincidence, connections that should not exist. Families of power, shadow councils, secret societies, all operating quietly, invisibly, shaping events, controlling the fates of thousands without ever stepping into the sun. Daniel swallowed hard. This isn't just about one town, is it?" he whispered. Nora shook her head. "No, this is everywhere. It always has been. Empires, revolutions, wars, even your own family lines, they're all guided, nudged, carefully curated." Mercer's mind struggled to process it. He saw maps spread across the pages, tiny marks, coded symbols, dates of births and deaths, all forming a lattice of influence. At first, it looked impossible, like the chaos of coincidence, but the repetition, the patterns, and the way events aligned over decades, it could not be chance. Someone, some entity had orchestrated this, invisibly, meticulously. Then Nora handed him a small journal. Its cover was worn, edges frayed, but inside, the words were sharp, precise, almost surgical. It documented experiments on human behavior, controlling masses through ritual, propaganda, and fear. Mercer's stomach churned. These weren't just observations, they were instructions, a blueprint for power that transcended governments, religions, even centuries. Daniel pointed to a single entry, the ink faded but still legible. A population controlled through the illusion of freedom remains the most obedient. Remove awareness, insert ritual, maintain surveillance. All else follows. His hands shook. They were controlling everything, everyone. Nora's eyes, dark and intense, fixed on them. And now, she said slowly, deliberately, you know. You are no longer ignorant. Once you see the threads, you cannot unsee them. You carry the knowledge, and with it comes a burden. You will be hunted, tested, questioned, and if you falter, you will be discarded like the countless before you who stumbled too close. The shadows in the room shifted, and Mercer realized they were not just shadows. They were warnings, reminders of the invisible eyes watching, calculating, recording. The basement, the papers, Nora herself, all of it was a crucible designed to forge understanding in those capable of surviving it. He glanced at Daniel. Their reality had fractured. Nothing outside these walls would ever make sense again. And in the distance, a faint, almost imperceptible hum rose, vibrating through the floorboards, a rhythm older than memory, older than the town itself, marking the cadence of control and manipulation that stretched far beyond their comprehension. The descent had begun. Mercer's hands hovered over the journal, reluctant to touch, yet unable to look away. Nora's eyes bore into him, patient but relentless. If you want to understand the depth, she said, you must follow the threads back to when control first learned to hide in plain sight. She flipped the journal open to a page thick with faded ink, and suddenly the room around them seemed to dissolve. They were no longer in Harwick, no longer in the quiet basement. They were standing at the edge of history itself, where power first learned to play its cruel game. It was 1666, London. Flames licked the night sky, fire consuming homes, streets, and lives. The Great Fire was taught as tragedy, as a catastrophe of chance, but the journal suggested otherwise. The diary's author, an anonymous figure, wrote of a calculated strategy, political rivalries manipulated through fear, chaos used to shift the masses into obedience, and rumors of divine wrath woven into the narrative to justify the unseen hand of control. People believed what they were told to believe. Fear became a tool, and the fire became a symbol, not just of destruction, but of power exerted invisibly, perfectly. Mercer's pulse quickened. So, disasters, wars, even epidemics, they've all been manipulated? Nora nodded slowly. Not always entirely, but often enough. Not through brute force alone, but through suggestion, through shaping perception, through creating stories the world believes. Look here, she pointed to a marginal note. Ignorance is the perfect scaffold for power. Teach them to fear what they cannot see, and they will obey what you command. Daniel swallowed, voice tight. All those events we learned about in school? History is rewritten to hide the hands pulling the strings? Nora's expression was grim. History is not what happened. History is what they allowed you to see. The threads have always existed. Monarchy, clergy, merchants, secret councils. They intersect in ways invisible to the eye, but palpable to those who know how to read the signs. Mercer shivered. Patterns emerged in his mind, bloodlines, alliances, disasters that conveniently empowered certain groups while suppressing others, entire societies bent not just by force, but by subtle orchestration of belief, fear, and ritualized control. She leaned closer. Now here's where most fail. Once you see the mechanism, you panic. You want to run, to hide, to pretend ignorance again. But knowledge is contagious. Once you understand, you cannot unknow. And the moment you act on it, that's when you become visible. That's when the game targets you. A cold breeze passed through the basement. The pages of the journal flickered, though there was no wind. The hum returned, low, insistent, almost alive. Mercer and Daniel exchanged a look. This was no longer a story. This was a blueprint, a warning, a map for the unseen hand that had been steering humanity since the earliest fires of civilization. And in that moment, the rules changed. The journal's pages seemed to breathe, curling in places as if alive. Mercer traced the lines of ink, and the words took on a sharper, almost sinister clarity. Nora's voice cut through the silence. Power does not only move in armies or governments. It moves in the shadows, through the lives of those closest to you, through the invisible levers of control that no one dares to name. Her words reminded Mercer of Elias Vance, of that quiet farmhouse in Alabama, of Nora's impossibly still features. The journal made the connection unmistakable. Elias had not merely mourned his wife, he had weaponized grief, bending time, biology, and perception into something unnatural. Science called it impossible. Faith called it blasphemy. The truth was something darker. Elias had discovered or stolen a secret that allowed him to halt life's progression, to rewrite its rules quietly, invisibly. Nora's fingers hovered over a margin note, faded but legible. Where grief meets obsession, the laws of nature bend for those who dare. Mercer felt a chill creep down his spine. It was one thing to see history manipulated on the scale of nations. It was another to witness manipulation on the scale of life itself, the quiet, invisible engineering of a child's existence. Nora's arrested growth, her eternal youth, was no miracle. It was a carefully constructed design, an experiment concealed within the guise of protection and devotion. And yet, there was a cruelty here Mercer had not anticipated. The human mind cannot endure isolation without bending. Elias had not just frozen Nora in body, he had shaped her mind, her reality, her very perception of normalcy. "What about the others?" Mercer asked, voice tight, almost a whisper. "Were there more experiments?" Nora's gaze sharpened. Always. Those who reach for knowledge without ethics leave trails. Sometimes it's children, sometimes it's towns, sometimes it's entire societies. But each trail is hidden, marked only for those who know how to look. Elias's work is a local echo of a far larger pattern, a blueprint repeated through generations. The hum in the basement deepened, resonating with the words on the page. Mercer realized it was no longer ambient. It was almost alive, a reminder that the forces they were studying were never inert. They reacted to awareness. "Do you understand what this means?"
Nora whispered, leaning closer. You are no longer a passive observer. Seeing the mechanism, tracing the threads of history, witnessing the bending of life itself changes you. Every choice you make from this point on is no longer just yours. You carry the weight of knowledge. And once you carry it, she paused, letting the silence settle, heavy and thick. You are part of the system, whether you like it or not. You have glimpsed the knife behind the curtain. Mercer swallowed, heart pounding. The journal lay open between them, every page a step further into forbidden understanding. The truth of Elias Vance was not an anomaly. It was a signal, a warning, and the map of manipulation it revealed extended far beyond one child, one town, one century. The basement felt colder. The hum vibrated through the walls. And Mercer understood, finally, that the descent into forbidden history was irreversible. Mercer closed the journal for a moment, but the weight of its revelations did not lift. If Elias Vance had manipulated life itself in 1870s Alabama, what did that mean for today? The patterns were unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Obsession masked as devotion, control hidden beneath care, anomalies hidden in plain sight. He realized that the shadow of Elias was far longer than anyone could imagine. Nora's voice cut through the tension, low and deliberate. History is not written only in books. It is encoded in actions, in behaviors, in the structures people build around themselves. What Elias did to Nora, freezing her body, shaping her mind, is the same blueprint applied across generations, across nations. The same principle hides in corporations, governments, schools, even families. The puppet strings are invisible, but they are everywhere. Mercer shivered. It was not just a story about a girl who never aged. It was about how power corrupts at the microscopic level, how obsession shapes reality, and how human systems, deliberate or accidental, preserve anomalies for their own benefit. A town oblivious to the truth, a society blinded by normalcy, every structure silently complicit in maintaining the illusion of order. He recalled patterns from modern headlines, disappearances, unexplained deaths, sudden declines of promising individuals. Maybe these were not random. Maybe someone, somewhere, was quietly orchestrating outcomes, much like Elias. The tools had changed, surveillance, medicine, technology, but the method, the psychology remained. It was a lattice of control, invisible to those trapped within it, yet painfully precise to those who understood the code. Nora leaned closer, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. And now that you see it, you cannot unsee it. You must decide what to do with this awareness. Most will flee from it. Most will choose ignorance. But knowledge, true knowledge, is a weight, and some truths demand action. Mercer felt his heart hammering. The room seemed to stretch and contract around him. He whispered the phrase twice, feeling a tremor of recognition, a subtle transformation take root in his mind. The ritual, small as it seemed, bound him to the truth. The past and present converged in that moment. He was no longer just an observer. He was now entangled in the hidden systems that once shaped a girl who never aged. And he knew, with absolute certainty, there was no turning back. The mechanics of Elias Vance's obsession were far darker and more deliberate than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't merely grief or eccentricity. It was a systematic, almost surgical manipulation of life itself. Mercer traced the evidence, the whispered accounts, the strange herbs, the meticulous routines, and it became horrifyingly clear. Elias had built a precision system of control over Nora's body and mind, a framework that mirrored what secret societies, shadow governments, and elite manipulators use on a larger scale. Every morning, every measured sip of tea, every spoonful of dark paste, every herb crushed with a mortar and pestle, it was all part of an algorithm of control, a formula honed to exactitude. Elias understood the human body not as a vessel for growth and life, but as a canvas, malleable and responsive to repeated interventions. What science failed to explain was not the herbs themselves. It was the pattern, the timing, the way they were deployed. There was an invisible rhythm that no outsider could perceive unless they were attuned to it. Mercer imagined the psychological layers. Nora's obedience wasn't just natural, it had been cultivated, reinforced daily, normalized to the point where she did not question it. Every day reinforced the previous day, every ritual cemented the next. Elias had created a self-reinforcing loop, a psychological cage invisible to the casual observer. It was both protective and imprisoning. The human mind, he realized, could be as carefully sculpted as the human body. And then there was the social dimension. The town of Harwick, with its casual glances, polite whispers, and unconscious complicity, became part of the system. Gossip, fear, moral judgment, all were tools Elias leveraged, creating a network of psychological reinforcement outside the walls of his home. Every observer unknowingly validated his control, every onlooker a node in the architecture of Nora's stasis. Mercer understood the terrifying truth. This was institutionalized manipulation in miniature, a laboratory in human control. The same principle exists today on macro levels. Governments design consent, corporations shape desire, schools mold compliance, and society trains conformity. Elias Vance's methods were a microcosm of how power embeds itself into life itself, through repetition, reinforcement, and concealment. "You see it now," Nora's voice whispered again. "Systems are built to preserve anomalies, to hide truths. The question is, will you remain a passive observer, or will you learn to navigate and, when necessary, dismantle them?" Mercer felt the weight of her words settle into his bones. He had glimpsed the machinery behind control, the gears hidden behind love, grief, and routine. And he knew that seeing it was the first step in understanding the full architecture of manipulation, the dangerous, intoxicating machinery of human obedience and power.